The world knows it as the king of currencies, but the dominance of the dollar is now under threat.
There is talk of the dollar's impending doom.
Is King Dollar going to be tossed off of its throne?
The world has become too dependent on the US dollar.
After dominating the economy for almost a century, the dollar is facing an increasing number of challenges and doubts about its future. With the US debt growing rapidly, more countries seeking independence from the dollar, and rivals acting quickly to deepen the damage. But are we really witnessing the end of the most powerful currency that humanity has ever known? In 1944, when the Allied victory in World War II became evident, 44 countries gathered in Bretton Woods to define the new global monetary system that would replace the classical gold standard. The United States, emerging greatly strengthened as the sole industrial power still standing, would be the foundation of this new system, where the dollar would be tied to gold at an exchange rate of $35 per ounce, and all other currencies would be tied to the dollar in turn. This agreement turned the dollar into the world's most powerful currency, aligned with the considerable advantage the United States had over its war-devastated peers. But the end of this war marked the beginning of another, the Cold War, characterized by the US and the Soviet Union seeking influence in other countries, with the former focusing on trade. Having the world's largest navy, the U.S. sought allies through trade, offering protection of maritime trade routes to countries that did not embrace communism. Thanks to this protection, international trade experienced explosive growth in the following decades, with countries previously ravaged by war like Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom, and France reindustrializing and taking over global trade. However, the United States, engaged in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the space race, and domestic social programs, was overspending, resulting in fiscal and trade deficits with its allies. As a consequence, the amount of gold reserves backing the dollar started to rapidly decline. The U.S. was buying more than it was selling to the world, causing more dollars to flow out of its economy. And as part of the Bretton Woods Agreement, many countries holding these dollars demanded their conversion into gold.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
When the United States could no longer sustain this conversion, it decided to break away from the Bretton Woods agreements in 1971, ending the dollar's convertibility to gold and initiating the fiat system. Initially, the dollar became the reserve currency due to the agreements at Bretton Woods and the significant difference in economic and military power that the United States had compared to the rest of the world. But why did it maintain its position after these agreements ended? Although there was a temporary decline in the acceptance of the dollar when it departed from the gold standard, it was eventually restored for several reasons. Firstly, the dollar benefited and continues to benefit from a network effect, where practically all countries in the world accept this currency because they know it will be usable in other countries as well. Additionally, the dollar is the currency with the highest amount of foreign debt, and those with this debt will require dollars to repay it, generating a high underlying demand for the currency. In second place, due to the depth of the financial market in the United States and the freedom to move money within the country. What does a country like Saudi Arabia do when left with large amounts of dollars after selling its oil? Besides spending a portion and using this money to import what it doesn't produce domestically, this surplus is invested. And the United States, with the largest financial market in the world and high levels of freedom for capital movement, is perfect for this. Thirdly, the United States is less dependent on international trade compared to its peers, which means a strong or weak dollar affects it much less than the competitiveness that China, Germany, or Japan would lose if their currencies significantly strengthened. This is closely related to the size of the U.S. economy, which has been the largest in the world by most measurements for the last century. Such a large economy allows for the creation of larger amounts of money and sustaining trade deficits with other countries, resulting in a significant circulation of dollars without necessarily leading to high inflation or depreciation against other currencies. However, all of this does not mean that the dollar is flawless and free from risks. Headlines about the end of the dollar began to appear in France in 1971 when the United States ended the convertibility of the dollar to gold. Since then, it has been a claim that has consistently surfaced, intensifying and disappearing again and again with each economic crisis, with the 2008 crisis probably being one of the most notorious. The 2008 crisis, caused by a housing bubble and excessive leverage of U.S. financial institutions, endangered the economy and the dollar. Partly because it caused a great panic that discouraged investment in the country and questioned the safety of financial assets that other countries had held in dollar reserves. Additionally, the dollar experienced one of the fastest declines in value in its history, with the dollar index reaching a historic low of 71 in early 2008, the lowest in the last 50 years. And now, a new wave of headlines raises the question again: has the end of the dollar begun? This time, it stems from the U.S. response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As part of the sanctions package imposed on Russia by the United States, England, the European Union, Japan, and others, the U.S. froze the central bank of Russia's international reserves held in dollars, which accounted for nearly half of its reserves. This was viewed negatively by many countries, as they realized that the use of the dollar inevitably gave enormous power to the United States over them, in what has been seen as the weaponization of the dollar.
Dollar's now strong, but there are two things we want to hold on to that position. Two things that threaten it. The first is the printing and devaluing money, but all countries right now are doing it. So in all countries, currencies are depreciating against goods and services prices. And then the other issue, which is interesting, is the weaponization of the dollar in the form of sanctions.
However, this has also coincided with a complex fiscal situation in the United States. Although it is generally exaggerated, the country's debt reaches $31 trillion, which represents around 122% of its economy. This has several implications for the dollar because if the government continues to spend more than it collects, it will incur more debt, with interest payments reducing the funds available for investment. The Congressional Budget Committee estimates that the debt is reducing the country's economic growth by 0.2% each year, which, while not significant in 1 year, becomes more noticeable over a longer period. This leads to the need for the country to rely on financial markets to cover its current expenses and, if left unaddressed, could create a vicious cycle. While a country's debt increasing is not necessarily bad, when it does so at a faster rate than its economy, as has been the case for the United States, it ends up eroding growth. It also puts the country in a vulnerable situation, as high levels of debt make it more challenging to manage its monetary policy and maintain high interest rates to keep inflation low. All of this creates an opportunity for its rivals to take advantage of the situation. In 2001, economist Jim O'Neill of Goldman Sachs published an article identifying Brazil, Russia, India, and China as countries with great growth potential for the coming decades. Despite having very little in common, South Africa was later added, and the group became an unofficial organization seeking to counterbalance the United States and especially the dollar. Vladimir Putin has been a strong proponent of this group creating its own currency to replace the dollar, and the upcoming meeting in August is generating high expectations for announcements on this matter. However, the idea of a BRICS currency replacing the dollar is more driven by emotions than rationality for several reasons. Firstly, the idea of having a common currency is entirely implausible because each country has entirely different economic cycles. While some may require higher interest rates due to inflation, others, like China, are seeking to avoid deflation and stimulate consumption. Additionally, while China, Brazil, and Russia are net exporters, India is a net importer. Therefore, while the former would be affected by a strong currency, losing competitiveness, India would be affected by a weak currency. On the other hand, the idea of having a currency formed by the individual currencies of each country and using it for transactions might work, but it would require opening up the capital markets. If China sells more to the rest of the BRICS, as is likely to be the case, it would end up with a large amount of reserves in reals, rubles, rupees, and rands. However, are these countries prepared and willing to absorb those reserves in the way the markets of the United States currently do? The answer is likely no. Nevertheless, all of this pales in comparison to the second reason: BRICS is practically China. The difference in the size of the economy among the 5 countries is vast, with China representing 72% of the group's economy, followed by India with 13%, Brazil and Russia with 6%, and South Africa with less than 2%. This raises the possibility of an economic integration revolving around China, something that India is not likely to permit. Not only do their economies differ in many ways, and what benefits India may affect China and vice versa, but they also have ongoing disputes along their borders. They are not exactly the best of friends. However, this does bring up a much more viable option, which is the possibility of the yuan becoming a reserve currency. China is the world's second largest economy, the largest by purchasing power parity, the world's largest exporter, and has maintained higher official growth than the United States over the last few decades. Therefore, the possibility of China eventually becoming the world's largest economy has been raised. And although China is not without challenges and issues, if this were to happen, would the yuan become the primary reserve currency in the world? To achieve this, China would need to face 2 challenges. The first challenge is opening its markets and lifting capital controls, allowing countries like Saudi Arabia to securely invest yuan in the Chinese market without worrying about liquidity, security, or regulations that could later prevent them from withdrawing their funds. China has toyed with this idea from the perspective of relaxing controls for oil exporting countries like Saudi Arabia. However, its financial markets are not as developed as the American ones, lacking the same liquidity, options, and capacity to absorb money. To accomplish this, there would need to be a massive and prolonged opening, not limited to just Arabia and other oil-exporting nations. But this presents a significant second challenge. If China were to do this, its currency would revalue. Currently, the yuan is close to its minimum levels of the last 5 years because the government tightly controls its value. If free movement were allowed and intervention reduced to keep it artificially low, its value would increase. Consequently, the country would lose competitiveness as its products would become more expensive for foreign buyers. Unlike the United States, China heavily relies on exports for its growth. Therefore, a freely valued yuan would represent a drastic change in the world's economic structure and one of the most significant transformations for the Chinese economy, not necessarily for the better. So, if the yuan or a currency from the BRICS is unlikely to counterbalance the dollar in the near future, what is happening with the position of the dollar? Beyond the sensationalist headlines, the numbers continue to support the dollar. While the concern over the drastic impact of its fall and its effect on the US and world economy is understandable, the reality is that not only does the dollar remain the strongest currency in the world, but it does so by a wide margin. 1 year after the sanctions, the dollar remains the preferred currency for central banks to hold their reserves, accounting for 59% of them, which is nearly 3 times the second reserve currency, the euro, and over 20 times the yuan, which holds a similar share of international reserves as Canada with 2.6%. Though it is true that there has been a reduction from the 70% of reserves held in dollars at the beginning of the century, it's important to clarify that part of this shift is due to an increase in central banks' reserves, leading them to take on more risks and reduce their exposure to dollars. Regarding Forex, the dollar is involved in over 80% of transactions. More than 40% of payments in the SWIFT system are in dollars. Close to 50% of international trade is conducted in dollars. And non-bank entities still hold 65% of debt in dollars. While the dollar's price has declined in recent months compared to a basket of currencies, it's important to understand that this price isn't necessarily correlated with the aforementioned data, which reflects its status as a reserve currency. Furthermore, this weakness is not reflected compared to its main rival, the yuan, nor against other BRICS currencies like the rupee or the ruble. If you want to learn more about market dynamics, remember to subscribe to support the channel. Abraham Lincoln stated that the destruction of the United States could only come from within the country itself, and a version of this could happen with the dollar. The future of the dollar will be more tied to the government's decisions, including how it manages spending, deficits, and debt, as well as the monetary policy implemented by the Federal Reserve. It is crucial for the country to break free from the vicious circle where the increasing debt erodes growth, leading to a situation where debt becomes an increasingly significant part of the economy. On the other hand, the world is facing two trends that will shape the fate of the economy, mainly affecting its main rival. The first of these trends is the demographic crisis, which, as a result of industrialization, reduced the fertility rate and caused people to have fewer children decades ago, resulting in fewer people of working age now. China's population has already started to decline, and it has a negative net migration rate. Additionally, the rapid aging of this population limits domestic demand and makes the country more dependent on international trade. Meanwhile, the United States, although maintaining a fertility rate below replacement level, is expected to continue growing in population in the coming decades, partly due to its rural population and migration. The second trend is deglobalization, which would affect the factory of the world more severely because it would reduce demand for the country's products. Unlike the demographic crisis, deglobalization is only a possibility and not a fact, because unlike the former, where you cannot create workers and consumers out of thin air, there are options for the future of globalization. Nevertheless, the United States has been implementing policies aimed at reshoring manufacturing to the country, providing subsidies and incentives for companies to invest in domestic production. One notable case is TSMC, the world's leading microchip producer, which has heavily invested in a plant in Arizona. Additionally, after decades of investment in production in China, U.S. companies are relocating part of their manufacturing to India, Vietnam, and Mexico. In 2022, Mexico received the largest investment from U.S. companies. If the United States manages to achieve this, even partially, it would reduce its trade deficit and strengthen the dollar further. Due to all of this, the potential demise of the dollar has most likely been exaggerated. And while it is unlikely to lose its status in the coming decades, we are confident that in Washington they will do their best to ensure that outcome. If you want to learn more details about the economic trends that could shape the world in the coming decades, I recommend you watch this video about the end of globalization.